"You're my first," she whispered, her voice barely above the wind. And Dylan McCall felt something crack open in his chest. He thought had been sealed shut for good. She stood at the edge of his property with one worn-out bag and a little boy clutching her skirt. And when her eyes finally lifted to meet his, he saw something that stopped him cold. Not fear, not desperation, just a quiet, trembling kind of hope that no woman had ever aimed at him before. If you've ever believed it was too late to be chosen, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel. Follow every part of this story to the very end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which Dylan McCall would later think was fitting, because nothing important had ever happened to him on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were fence days. Tuesdays were the days he ran inventory on what little he had left and made peace with the numbers. Tuesdays were the kind of days that reminded a man exactly how quiet a house could get when no one lived in it but him. He'd almost thrown the letter away without opening it. It had come through the county post mixed in with an overdue feed bill and a notice from the bank that he didn't need to read twice to understand. He'd set it on the kitchen table and left it there for 3 days before he finally sat down with his second cup of black coffee and broke the seal. The Hardin County Matrimonial Correspondence Bureau, established 1879, facilitating suitable matches between willing parties of good moral character. Dylan had read the entire thing twice, folded it back along its original creases, and then sat very still for a long time. He was 32 years old. He owned 114 acres of Texas grassland that had been slowly losing the argument against drought for the better part of 3 years. He had a barn that needed a new roof, a well that needed re-drilling, and a left knee that reminded him every cold morning that he'd taken a piece of Confederate iron at Chickamauga that the doctors had never fully gotten out. He had no family left in Hardin County. He had 2 ranch hands, Hector, who was 60 and loyal as a hound, and Cal, who was 19 and mostly good for heavy lifting and complaining about the heat. He had a horse named Goliath, who had better judgment than most men he'd known, and a cattle herd that had been reduced by drought and disease to 43 head. He did not have a wife. He did not, if he was being honest with himself, in the particular way that only early morning and too much coffee allowed, have much of anything that constituted a life. He'd written back the same afternoon. Not because he believed in it. Not because some romantic notion had seized him between one heartbeat and the next. He'd written back because the alternative was continuing exactly as he was, and he was old enough and tired enough to recognize that what he was doing wasn't living. It was endurance. And endurance without purpose was just a slower way of disappearing. His letter had been brief. He'd listed what he had: the land, the cattle, the ranch house with 4 rooms, a working kitchen, a root cellar that stayed cool even in July. He'd listed what he needed: someone capable, someone steady, someone willing to work alongside a man who didn't talk much and couldn't promise anything pretty, but could promise honest. He'd mentioned almost as an afterthought that he was not cruel, and that whatever arrangement was reached would be respected. He had not mentioned the war. He never mentioned the war. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from a woman in Galveston named Evelyn Hart. She was 22, an orphan. She wrote in a clean, careful hand that told him she was educated, or had been once before. Whatever had happened to her family had happened. She didn't explain it directly. She wrote around it the way people write around the things that have cost them the most, carefully, with wide margins, making sure not to press too hard on the paper. She had a son named Samuel, 4 years old, whose father was not in the picture and whose name she didn't offer and Dylan didn't ask for. She said she was small and not particularly strong, but that she was not afraid of work and had never been. She said she was not looking for a fairy story. She said she was looking for something solid. Dylan had read that line 4 times. Something solid. He'd written back and told her to come. The wagon from the Beaumont Road arrived on a Friday morning in early April, and Dylan was at the fence line when he heard it coming. He made himself finish the section of wire he was working on before he walked back to the house. He wasn't going to be the kind of man who ran. He heard Hector call out from near the barn, something low and respectful, the kind of voice Hector used when he wanted Dylan to know something without making a fuss about it. Dylan set down his tools and turned around. She was climbing down from the wagon. He registered the details without meaning to, the way a man registers anything after years of having to read a situation fast. Small as she'd said. Dark hair pinned back, but not primly, more like practically the way a woman pins her hair when she doesn't have time for anything else. A blue dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone softer than it started. One bag. One trunk that the wagon driver was unloading with slightly more care than his type usually managed. And the boy Samuel, who jumped down from the wagon before anyone could help him, and immediately looked at everything with the focused intensity of a child who had learned to assess new places quickly. That detail hit Dylan somewhere he hadn't expected. He knew what it meant when a child looked at a new place the way that boy was looking at his ranch. It meant the child had been in too many new places. It meant the child had learned that the way a place looked at you in the first 5 minutes usually told you everything you needed to know about whether you were safe. Dylan walked toward them at an even pace, not fast, not slow. He'd learned a long time ago that the way you approach something set the tone for everything that came after. The woman Evelyn heard his footsteps on the hard ground and turned. For just a moment before her expression settled into something careful and composed, he saw what was underneath. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. Something that had survived fear so many times, it had developed its own weather. She met his eyes, and then she opened her mouth, and what came out was not what either of them had prepared for. "You're my first," she whispered. Her voice caught. Her face went red so fast he could see it happen, the color climbing from her throat to her cheeks like something she couldn't stop. She looked down. Her hands found each other in front of her and held on. The sentence just stopped, hanging there in the April air between them, incomplete, raw, more honest than anything that had been planned. Dylan went still. Not because of what she'd said, he didn't know yet what she'd meant. He went still because of the sound of it. The way her voice had broken exactly on the word first, like she'd been carrying it and set it down too hard. There was something in that sound that bypassed every wall he'd spent 13 years building and went straight to the part of him that still knew what it felt like to be seen. He didn't say anything. He wasn't a man who filled silences with words he hadn't thought through. He looked at her. He looked at the boy. He looked back at her. "Dylan McCall," he said. "You must be Evelyn." She pulled in a breath and lifted her eyes again. "Yes." A pause. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was going to say something and She stopped, steadied. "Yes, I'm Evelyn, and this is Samuel." The boy had come to stand beside her and was looking at Dylan with the clear, unblinking appraisal of a 4-year-old who had decided not to pretend. Dylan crouched down so he was on the boy's level. It was something he'd learned a long time ago, not from anyone who taught him deliberately, but from watching the way men who were good with horses approached an animal that wasn't sure yet. You didn't loom. You got down to where they were. "Samuel," he said, "you want to see the horses?" The boy looked at his mother. Evelyn gave a small, quick nod. Samuel looked back at Dylan. "Yeah," the boy said. "Matter of fact. Careful. Barn's that way," Dylan said, straightening up and pointing. "Hector'll show you. Man over there with the gray hat." Samuel looked at Hector, who was already walking toward them with the unhurried patience of a man who had no enemies and never had. Dylan turned back to Evelyn. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you the house. We can work the rest out." She was quiet on the walk in. He noticed she was taking inventory not of his belongings, but of the structure of the place. The distances between buildings, where the well was, the angle of the shade in late morning. Information. She was collecting information, and she was doing it efficiently, and she thought he wasn't watching. He was watching. The kitchen was the first thing she asked about, and he showed her where everything was without explanation or preamble, because she clearly didn't need either. She opened the pantry and looked at the shelves with an expression that was impossible to read. I can work with this, she said. All right. She turned around and looked at him directly for the first time since the wagon. She had gray eyes. He hadn't been close enough to see that before, and they were the kind of eyes that had already decided not to look away from things. I want to be clear with you, she said. I appreciate that. I'm not looking to be a burden. I can cook. I can help with accounts if you keep them. I can mend, I can garden, and I'm better with livestock than most women you'd find. Samuel is well behaved, and he's a fast learner. He won't be in your way. Dylan leaned against the doorframe. I didn't say I was worried about that. I know you didn't. She folded her hands again, that same gesture from outside, the one that meant she was holding herself steady. I just want you to know what you're getting. I've found it's better to be honest about that up front. So have I, he said. A beat. Your letter said you weren't cruel, she said. Just like that. Flat and factual. It did. How do I know that? Oh, he looked at her for a moment. It was a fair question. It was actually one of the most intelligent questions anyone had ever asked him in his life. You don't yet, he said. Same as I don't know what kind of person you are yet. We're going to have to find that out the old-fashioned way. Which is time, he said. And paying attention. Something in her expression shifted. Not softening exactly, it was too early, and she was too careful for that. But something acknowledged. Something that said that answer was not what I was expecting, and I'm going to have to think about it. All right, she said. Your room is at the end of the hall. Samuel can have the smaller room next to it. There's a lock on both doors. She blinked. He saw it, that small, involuntary reaction to information she hadn't expected. I don't want you to feel unsafe in my house, he said plainly. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, you're a person, not an arrangement. I'll remember that, if you will. She looked at him for a long, careful moment. Okay, Mr. McCall, she said quietly. I'll remember that. The first week was a negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. Dylan got up at 4:30 every morning the way he always had and started coffee on the stove before going out to the barn. He did not change his routine because she was there. He'd thought about it and decided that changing everything for her arrival would feel false, and false was the one thing he had no tolerance for. She was up by 5. He heard her the first morning, the particular sounds of someone trying not to make noise, and went out the back without acknowledgement because she clearly needed to find her own rhythm in the kitchen without him watching. When he came back in at 6 for the first cup, the coffee was already made. There was biscuit bread on the board, and she was nowhere in sight. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the biscuits. Then he poured himself a cup and ate standing up the way he always did. On the third morning when he came back in, she was there sitting at the far end of the table with Samuel, who was eating with both hands, and the total focus of a very hungry small person. Evelyn had a cup of coffee, and she was reading a Bible well-worn, the kind that had been through more than one pair of hands. She looked up when he came in. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He poured his coffee. He sat down at his end of the table. Samuel looked at him, and then back at his biscuit, having apparently already categorized Dylan under a heading he was still defining. They ate in silence. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people who were not yet sure what to say and had agreed without words to wait until they were. On the fourth morning, Samuel climbed up into the chair next to Dylan's without asking and put his elbows on the table. Dylan looked at him. The boy looked back. "Hector said you got 43 cows, Samuel said. 43 head. Yeah. That's a lot. Used to be more." Samuel chewed on that along with his biscuit. "Why? Drought, some sickness. Things happen to a herd." "Do they die?" "Sometimes." Samuel nodded gravely the way children nod when they're filing information for future use. "Mama said things die and then they go somewhere good." Dylan glanced at Evelyn. She was looking at her coffee. "That's one way to think about it," Dylan said. "What's another way?" "That things die, and they feed the ground, and the ground feeds more things." Samuel thought about that. So dying isn't all bad. Hasn't been in my experience. Samuel nodded again. Then he finished his biscuit and slid off the chair and went to find Hector, because Hector had apparently become his primary interest in life. Dylan looked at the place where the boy had been sitting. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, careful assessing, like she was solving for something, and hadn't gotten to the answer yet. "He's not usually like that with people he doesn't know," she said. "Like what?" "Comfortable," she said. "This fast." Dylan picked up his cup. "He's a smart kid. Kids who've had to learn to read people fast generally are." He heard the small sound she made, almost nothing, barely a breath. But he heard it. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He'd said what was true, and the truth didn't need company. He found the broken water barrel on Wednesday morning near the East Garden patch she'd been quietly reclaiming from the weeds that had taken it over in the 3 years since he'd stopped bothering with it. The wood had split along one stave, not new damage, old damage that had kept splitting, and the way it was sitting, it would have collapsed on someone eventually. He repaired it that afternoon without mentioning it to her. The next morning, the fresh bread left on the board was corn cake instead of biscuit bread, and there was a small jar of preserved peaches he hadn't seen before set next to the coffee pot. He didn't mention that either, but he ate 2 pieces of corn cake, which was more than he usually ate in a morning, and the preserved peaches were the best thing he'd tasted since he couldn't remember when. This was how it went. No declarations, no negotiations, just 2 careful people making small gestures and watching to see what came back. On Friday, he came in at noon and found her at the table with the account ledgers he hadn't touched since January, and she had a pencil in her hand and an expression on her face like she was doing math in her head faster than he could do it with paper. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "You've been undercharging Hennessy for the hay. He owes you for 6 months. That's $42. Dylan stood very still. "You looked at my accounts." "They were on the shelf." "I didn't say you could." "I know." She held his gaze. She didn't apologize. "But if you don't know you're being shorted, you can't fix it, and you're being shorted. Hennessy's not going to tell you." Silence. Dylan walked to the table and looked at the numbers she'd circled. $42. He looked at her handwriting, clean, precise, each numeral the same size. "How did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My father kept books for a mercantile before he died. I helped him from the time I was 7 until the time he passed." She set the pencil down. "I know it wasn't my place to—" "No," he said. "It was." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Show me what else you found." Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. It was too early, and she was still too careful for a smile, but something close to one. Something like the precursor to a smile, the part that comes before a person lets themselves believe something is safe enough to be happy about. She turned the ledger toward him. They sat at the table for 2 hours, going over 6 months of accounts together, and by the time they were done, Dylan had a list of 3 men who owed him money, and 1 supplier who had been overcharging him for grain since the previous fall. Evelyn had done the arithmetic for all of it in her head before writing it down, and she hadn't been wrong once. When they were done, Dylan sat back and looked at the ledger and then at her. "You said in your letter you could help with accounts if I kept them." "I did? I should have let you start sooner." "You didn't know me," she said simply. "No," he said, "but I'm starting to." He stood up and put his hat back on and went back out to work. Behind him, he heard the sound of the ledger closing. He also heard very quietly the sound she made when she let out a long breath she'd been holding. He wasn't sure she knew he heard it. He kept walking. The crisis came on a Thursday, 12 days after her arrival, and it came in the form of a horse. One of the mares had gotten through a fence gap Cal had missed in his inspection and had wandered into the rougher ground along the creek's eastern edge. By the time they found her, she'd tangled her foreleg in some old rusted wire that had been lying in the brush since before Dylan had bought the property, and she was down on her side and panicked, which was the worst possible condition for extracting tangled wire safely. Hector and Cal were both there, and both of them were experienced enough to know the problem. A horse down and panicked was capable of breaking its own leg fighting the restraint, and the wire was old and had barbs, and removing it wrong would lay the skin open. They needed the animal calm, and they needed it calm fast. Dylan got down beside the horse and put his hands on her neck and spoke low and even the way he always had with horses, and she stopped thrashing immediately. But the moment he moved toward the wire, she started again. "Someone needs to hold her," Hector said. "Keep her steady while you work the wire." "I'll do it." Dylan turned around. Evelyn was standing 20 feet away. She'd come from somewhere he hadn't heard her approach, and she was already reading the situation, her eyes moving from the horse to the wire, to Dylan's hands, to the angle of the leg. "You know horses," Dylan said. "Enough." She was already walking toward the animal. "She needs a voice, and hands she doesn't know to be a threat. What do you need from me?" Dylan looked at her for 1 second. Just one. "Get down by her head," he said. "Put your hands here and here." He showed her. "Talk to her. Don't stop talking. Keep your voice even no matter what she does." Evelyn nodded once and did exactly what he said. What happened next was 20 minutes that required more nerve than most people carried. The mare fought twice before settling under Evelyn's hands. The wire was barbed in 3 places and had wrapped twice, and getting it off cleanly required Dylan to work slowly and hold tension without flinching while the animal's weight shifted. Cal held the leg. Hector stood ready. And Evelyn talked to that horse the entire time. Low, steady, unhurried. She talked about nothing in particular. The weather, the garden, something about Samuel, something about the color of the sky that afternoon. Not because the horse understood any of it. Because the horse understood the sound, and the sound said you are not alone, and this is not the end. When the wire finally came free, the mare scrambled to her feet fast, and Cal barely got out of the way. Dylan had to move hard to avoid the hindquarters. He caught himself straightened up, turned around. Evelyn was standing 2 feet from where the horse had launched herself upright. She had blood on her sleeve from where the animal had caught her, not badly a graze, but red against the blue fabric, and she was breathing hard, and her hands were shaking. But she was standing. "You all right?" Dylan said. "Yes." She looked at her sleeve, then back at him. "The leg, did we get it all?" "We got it all. She'll be sore, but she'll heal." He paused. "You did good." She looked at him, and this time what crossed her face was something he didn't have a name for yet. Something that lived between relief and disbelief, like a person who had just done something they weren't sure they were capable of, and hadn't caught up to the proof yet. "I wasn't sure." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I wasn't sure I could hold her." "You didn't just hold her," Dylan said. "You settled her." Cal and Hector were walking the mare toward the barn. The evening was coming on. The creek was making its sound in the near distance. Evelyn looked out past the tree line for a moment. That particular way people look when they are trying to decide whether they are allowed to feel something. Then she turned back and started walking toward the house. Dylan watched her go, and for the first time in a very long time, for the first time since a battlefield in Georgia had taken from him the ability to believe the world could deliver anything except loss. Dylan McCall felt something he didn't have a word for yet either. Something that started, he thought, a lot like respect. And maybe underneath that barely audible like the creek under the wind. Something that started like hope. Chakata. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house. The particular sounds of a house that had more than one person in it, which was so different from the silence he'd been living in, that it almost felt like a different structure altogether. He heard Samuel turn over in his sleep. He heard the small sounds of the house settling in the cooling night air. He thought about what she had said when she arrived. "You're my first..." He still didn't know what she'd meant to say after that. She hadn't finished it. She'd gone red and looked away, and in the 12 days since neither of them had mentioned it. He thought about her hands on the mare. He thought about the way she'd talked low and steady, giving that animal her voice as an anchor when everything else was threat and pain. He thought about a woman who could do that, being the same woman who had stood at the edge of his property with one bag and a child, and a look in her eyes that said she had survived everything that had tried to stop her, and wasn't sure yet if she was allowed to put it down. He wasn't sure who she was yet. That was the truth. But he was starting to think that whoever she was not who he'd expected. He wasn't sure yet if that was a problem. He suspected it was not. Outside, the Texas night made its sounds, wind in the grass, something moving far off near the creek, Goliath shifting in his stall. The sounds of a working ranch at rest. The sounds of a life that was not finished yet. Dylan McCall closed his eyes. He did not sleep for a long time. But when he finally did, it was deeper than it had been in years. The morning after the mare incident, Dylan came in from the barn to find Evelyn had moved the kitchen table 6 inches to the left. It was such a small thing, such a completely unremarkable adjustment. The table had been in the same position for 9 years since the day he'd set it down after hauling it in from the wagon, and he had never once thought about whether it was in the right place. But she had looked at that kitchen, the way the light came through the east window, the distance between the stove and the workspace, the angle a person had to turn when carrying something hot, and she had solved a problem he hadn't known existed. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the table in its new position. He didn't say anything. He poured his coffee and sat down. She was at the stove with her back to him, and he could tell by the set of her shoulders that she was waiting. Not anxiously, she was past anxious, he was beginning to understand. She waited the way a person waits when they have learned that reactions are information and they intend to collect all of it. "Better angle," he said finally. A pause. "I thought so. You were right." Another pause shorter. "I usually am about kitchens." He almost smiled. He didn't, but it was closer than it had been in a long time. Samuel came in from the back with mud on both boots and a piece of flat creek stone in his fist that he clearly considered important. He held it up for Dylan's inspection with the gravity of a man presenting evidence. "I found it by the water," Samuel said. "Hector says it's got iron in it." Dylan took the stone and turned it over. Dark grain running through pale rock. "Hector's right. You can see where the iron oxidized turned color from the water exposure." Samuel's brow creased. "What's oxidized?" "Rusted, but slow, the way stone does it instead of metal." The boy took the stone back and stared at it with entirely new intensity. "So the rock is rusting?" "In a manner of speaking." "Huh." Samuel set the stone carefully on the windowsill, apparently deciding it had earned a place of significance. "Can I keep it?" "It's your stone," Dylan said. "You found it." Evelyn set a plate in front of Dylan without a word. Egg salt pork, the last of the corn cake from yesterday. She ruffled Samuel's hair as she passed and steered him toward the wash basin with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been doing it for 4 years without anyone's help. Dylan ate and watched the two of them move around each other, the small, wordless choreography of a mother and son who had spent a lot of time in small spaces together and had learned to anticipate each other the way you learned a partner in a dance. There was something in the watching that he couldn't name and didn't try to. He just noticed it the way he noticed the iron in the stone. Something real, something that had formed under pressure, something that didn't wash away. He finished his coffee and stood up. "I'm riding the east fence today," he said. "Cal's pulling the posts on the south section. If Hector needs something from town, he should go before noon road gets soft after the afternoon rain." Evelyn looked up from the wash basin. "Does it rain every afternoon here?" "April through June, mostly." "I'll plan dinner for before it." He nodded. He put on his hat and went out. He was 3 steps from the door when he heard Samuel's voice from inside very clearly, because the window was open. "Mama, do you like it here?" A pause. The particular pause of a mother choosing her words for a child who will remember them. "I think I might," Evelyn said. "Ask me again in a month." Dylan kept walking, but he carried that answer with him all the way to the east fence. The east fence took most of the day. 2 posts had heaved from the winter freeze, and one section of wire had been stretched past usefulness by something large that had pushed through probably a spooked steer during the last storm. Dylan worked methodically the way he did everything, and by the time he'd finished, it was late afternoon, and the sky was doing what it did in April, building something heavy in the northwest that smelled like iron and wet grass. He was loading the tools back onto the horse when he heard hooves on the road and looked up. The rider was a man he recognized, which was not necessarily a good thing. Gerald Pratt. He worked for the land office in Beaumont, or said he did, which was not quite the same as actually doing so. He was a large man in a clean coat that was too clean for someone who spent time outdoors, which told you something, and he had a smile that arrived before the rest of his face was ready for it. "McCall," Pratt said, pulling up. "Been a while." "Pratt. Heard you took on a wife." "Word travels." "Small county." Pratt looked around at the fence line with the casual assessment of a man who is pretending to admire something while actually calculating its value. "Place looks better than it did last fall." Fences tend to look better when they're fixed. Pratt chuckled, the kind of chuckle that doesn't involve any actual amusement. "Listen, I wanted to come by friendly-like before anything official happened. You know the Hennessy parcel on the north side of your property abuts the county survey line." "I know where my property line is." Sure. Pratt shifted in the saddle. "Thing is, there's been some question raised about the original deed on the Northern 40, survey from 1873, that may not have been filed correctly. County's looking into it." Dylan went very still. He'd heard this kind of thing before. Not the specific words, but the shape of them, the way something legitimate sounding was used to soften the ground for something that wasn't legitimate at all. "My deed is recorded," Dylan said. "Has been since I bought the property in '76. "Oh, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is." Pratt kept smiling. "Just wanted to give you fair notice as a neighborly courtesy. You might want to pull those documents and have them looked over. Make sure everything's in order." "I'll do that." "Good man." Pratt touched his hat brim. "Give my regards to the new missus." He rode on. Dylan stood and watched him go, and the feeling that settled in his chest was not a good one. It was the feeling he'd had at Chickamauga the morning of the battle before the first shot was fired, the particular weight of knowing something was coming, and not yet knowing its exact shape. He rode back to the ranch faster than he'd gone out. Evelyn was in the kitchen when he came in, and she read his face the moment she saw it. He'd been noticing this about her, the speed of her perception, the way she gathered information from a person, the way she gathered it from a room. She didn't make a fuss about it. She just turned from the stove and said, "What happened?" He told her about Pratt. All of it plainly, without softening the edges. He'd found that she didn't need her edges softened. She sat at the table and listened with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes on his face, and she didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The Northern 40, she said. "That's what he said. That's the parcel with the creek access." He looked at her. "You know that already. I walked the property lines on Tuesday. I wanted to understand what we were working with." She said it simply without apology. Creek access is the most valuable thing you have in a drought. If someone wanted to create a reason to dispute that land, specifically, that's the land they'd pick. Dylan sat down across from her. "You think it's manufactured? I think a man who works for the county land office doesn't ride out to a fence line to give neighborly courtesy. I think he came to see whether you'd be rattled by it." "Were we?" "I wasn't," she said. And the evenness of her voice when she said it was something he had to consciously respond to without letting it show on his face. "Do you have your deed documents?" "In the strongbox under the floorboard in the front room." She stood up immediately. "Get them." He pulled the strongbox, worked the combination lock, and spread the deed documents on the kitchen table, while the rain that had been building all afternoon started in earnest on the roof above them. Evelyn bent over the papers with her hair coming loose from its pins on one side, and read with the focused speed of someone who had done this kind of reading before. "Here," she said, tapping a line. "Recorded in the Hardin County Deed Registry, March 14, 1876. Signed by the county surveyor and 2 witnesses." She straightened up. "That's a clean recording. Pratt knows that." Whatever he's suggesting about the 1873 survey that predates your purchase and couldn't invalidate a clean 1876 recording. Unless someone alters the earlier survey, Dylan said. She met his eyes. Yes, unless someone does that. The rain came down harder. Samuel was asleep in his room, had fallen asleep before supper, worn out from whatever he and Hector had gotten up to all afternoon. The kitchen was quiet except for the rain and the lamp between them and the sound of papers being turned. "You've seen this before?" Dylan said. It wasn't quite a question. She didn't answer immediately. She straightened the papers and aligned their edges with the careful precision of a person doing something with their hands to give their thoughts time to settle. "My father's land," she said finally, "after he died. There were debts we didn't know about, or that's what we were told. Men came with papers. I was 16. She set the stack of documents down. "I didn't know how to read a legal document then. I do now." Dylan looked at her across the table. 16. He thought about that. He thought about a 16-year-old girl being handed papers by men in clean coats and not knowing how to fight back. He thought about the cost of that, not just the land, but the particular kind of wound it left, the one that made a person learn everything they hadn't known fast enough, so it couldn't happen again. "I'm sorry," he said. She shook her head. "I didn't tell you for sympathy. I told you because you should know I understand what this is." She looked at the documents again. "We need to get these to a lawyer, someone in Beaumont who isn't connected to the county office." "I know a man," Dylan said. "Asa Morrow. He's straight." "Can you get to him this week?" "I'll go Thursday." She nodded. Then she gathered the documents and squared them again and slid them back into the strongbox. Dylan watched her hands, the efficiency of them. The lack of wasted motion, the way she worked like a woman who had learned that every unnecessary movement was a cost she couldn't afford. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "Thank you." She blinked. It was such a small reaction, such a contained, involuntary thing, but he saw it. Like the word had landed somewhere she wasn't expecting to be touched. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "This is my home too now." She said it quietly, and he had the impression she was slightly surprised to hear herself say it. Like the word home had come out before she'd decided to let it. She picked up the strongbox and took it back to the front room. Dylan sat at the kitchen table for a moment in the sound of the rain and didn't move. Thursday came, and he rode to Beaumont, and Asa Morrow listened to everything he said, and looked at every document, and confirmed what Evelyn had read. In the deed, the 1876 recording was clean and clear, and any attempt to use a pre-purchase survey to cloud it would fail in a competent court. But the key word, Morrow said, leaning back in his chair, with the expression of a man who had been a lawyer in Texas for 30 years and had lost his capacity for surprise, was competent. "The Hardin County Court is not always competent," Morrow said. "Not when Consolidated Land out of Houston decides it wants something. They've been buying up creek access parcels all along this part of the county for the better part of 2 years. Yours would connect 2 sections they already hold." Dylan went cold and then very, very still. Consolidated Land. "You know them. I know of them." He knew of them the way you knew of a disease by what it left behind. 3 ranchers in the northern part of the county had sold out in the past 18 months. 2 of them had sold willingly or said they had. One of them had not said much of anything after because he'd left the county entirely. "Pratt works for them," Dylan said. "Not the county office." Morrow raised an eyebrow. "I'd be careful saying that without proof." "I'm not saying it publicly. I'm saying it to you." The lawyer nodded slowly. "What I can do is file a preemptive affirmation of the deed in the state registry, takes it out of the county court's jurisdiction entirely. It's a legal maneuver they won't expect, and it'll buy you time." "Do it." "It'll cost you." "I know." He rode back to the ranch with the late afternoon light slanting long and orange across the grassland, and thought about Consolidated Land, and what it meant that they had sent Pratt to his fence line on the same week that his new wife had gone walking his property to understand what they were working with. He thought about the timing of that. By the time he got home, he had not reached any conclusions he could call certain. But the uneasy feeling in his chest had settled into something harder and more specific, and hard specific things were easier to work with than vague dread. Sag, he told her that evening. All of it, Morrow Consolidated Land, the preemptive filing. She listened the same way she always listened, without interruption and without visible alarm, though he was beginning to understand that her lack of visible alarm was not the same as the absence of it. It was containment. It was a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. When he finished, she said, "How long before Consolidated knows about the filing?" Morrow said a week, maybe less. They'll have someone in the state office. Then we have a week to get everything in order here. She was quiet for a moment. Are there other men like Pratt in the county? Other people connected to them? Possibly. I don't know who yet. We should know. I agree. She looked at him directly. I want you to understand something, Dylan. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed it. He saw the slight awareness cross her face, the tiny recalibration. She didn't retreat from it, though. She held the ground. I'm not going to be frightened off this land. Whatever they try, I'm not going. This is Samuel's home now. I don't intend to let it be taken. He held her gaze. Neither do I. Good. She stood up and started clearing the supper things. Then we're agreed. Dylan sat at the table and watched her move, and thought about how 12 days ago a woman had stepped off a wagon and whispered half a sentence and gone red to her hairline. He thought about the distance between that moment and this one. 12 days. The same woman and completely different. Or not different. More. Like a fire that had been banked low under ash and was finally getting enough air. He thought not for the first time about what she had been trying to say when she'd arrived. You're my first. He still didn't know, and he found with a clarity that surprised him that he very much wanted to. The next 10 days moved in a rhythm that Dylan had not expected, not the rhythm of temporary arrangement or careful cohabitation, but something that felt uncomfortably and inescapably like the rhythm of a household that had found its feet. Evelyn took over the account-keeping entirely with his full agreement, and inside a week, she had corresponded with 2 of the 3 men who owed him money, and one of them had already paid. The garden she had been quietly reclaiming started showing green rows of things she'd planted that Dylan hadn't noticed her planting. She mended the curtains in the front room without asking. He didn't even know the curtains needed mending until they were done, and she reorganized the root cellar according to a system of her own devising that made finding anything in it twice as fast. She did all of this without commentary or announcement. She just did it the way she did everything efficiently, without waste, with the focused attention of a woman who understood that the life of a ranch was held together by 100 small competencies that no one celebrated, because no one noticed them until they failed. Dylan noticed them. He started noticing them, the way he had once learned to notice things on the move automatically, involuntarily, the way the body orients towards something important before the mind has caught up. The way she tied back her hair on the days she was going to work in the garden. The slight tightening around her eyes when she was calculating something. The way she laughed at Samuel, sudden and unguarded, and completely different from her usual careful composure, like the laugh lived in a different room from the rest of her self-protection. He noticed them and said nothing, and went on with his work. Samuel, for his part, had attached himself to both Hector and Dylan, with the focused devotion of a small person who has identified reliable sources of information and intends to extract all of it. He followed Dylan to the corral on the mornings Dylan was working with the horses, and he sat on the fence rail and asked questions, with the inexhaustible curiosity of a boy who had spent a lot of time in places where asking questions was not always welcome, and was making up for lost time. Why does Goliath do that with his ears when you come close? Ears forward means he's paying attention to me. Ears back means he's uncomfortable. What if they go sideways? Means he's tired or thinking about something else. Samuel studied Goliath's ears with great seriousness. I think right now he's paying attention. He usually is when someone's working near him. He likes to know what's happening. Me too, Samuel said. And the simplicity of it, The complete unguarded identification with the horse made Dylan's chest do the thing it had been doing more frequently lately, that particular constriction that wasn't pain, but lived close to it. "Your mama know where you are?" Dylan asked. "I told her I was with you." "And that was all right with her?" Samuel squinted at him. "She said don't bother you if you're working." "You're not bothering me." "Okay." Samuel went back to watching the horse. Then, "Are you going to be my papa?" Dylan's hands stopped moving. He turned and looked at the boy on the fence rail. Samuel was watching him with the gray eyes he'd gotten from his mother, that same calm, direct, assessing look, the look that didn't flinch from the answer, whatever it was. "What made you think about that?" Dylan said carefully. "Tommy Beaumont at the feed store said my mama got herself a husband, and that meant I'd have a papa now." Samuel's expression was matter-of-fact, like he was reporting weather. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say." Dylan was quiet for a moment. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, and he meant it as a real question. Samuel thought about it with visible seriousness. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "I just wanted to know if you were going to leave." The word hit Dylan somewhere unguarded and specific. Leave. Said in the tone of a child who had already experienced the concept at close range and was taking careful inventory of the risk. "I'm not going anywhere," Dylan said. "This is my ranch. I'll be here." Samuel looked at him for another long moment, apparently running some internal calculation. "Okay," he said. He sounded underneath the carefulness like a small person setting down something very heavy. Dylan turned back to the horse and didn't let anything show on his face. But his hands were not entirely steady for the rest of the morning. He didn't tell Evelyn about the conversation, but that evening when she was washing the supper dishes and he was sitting at the table going over the notes from his meeting with Morrow, he heard her stop, just stop in the middle of what she was doing. The small sounds of the kitchen went absent. He looked up. She was standing at the basin, her hands still in the water, looking at nothing in particular, or looking at something interior that he couldn't see. "You all right?" he said. She blinked and came back. "Yes, sorry." She went back to the dishes. "I was thinking about Pratt." "Don't let him take up too much space in your head." "I know." A pause. "I'm not afraid of him. I don't like not knowing where the threat is coming from. I don't like the shape being unclear. It'll clarify. I know that too." She dried her hands and turned around. She looked tired, not the tired of a day's work, but the deeper kind, the kind that accumulated. "Dylan." "Yeah. When this is over, when the legal business is settled and the land is secured." She stopped, and he could see her choose the words. "I want this to be a real home, not just a transaction, not just arrangement." She said the last word like it had a bad taste. "I know that's not what we agreed to exactly, but I need you to know that's what I'm working toward. Here." Dylan set down his pen. He looked at her across the kitchen in the lamplight. This woman who had walked onto his land with one bag and a child and more spine than most men he'd known, who had read his accounts and settled his horse and looked Gerald Pratt's implications in the eye without blinking. "That's what I'm working toward too," he said. She held his gaze. Something in her steadied visibly like a caught breath finally released. "Good," she said quietly. She turned down the lamp and went down the hall to her room. Dylan sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house. Outside, something moved in the night, an animal near the barn. Goliath shifting the ordinary sounds of a living ranch in a living night. He thought about consolidated land and Gerald Pratt and Asa Morrow's careful voice in his Beaumont office. He thought about everything coming, the shape of it still unclear in the darkness, still forming. And underneath all of that running like the creek under its sound like iron in pale stone, he thought about a woman in a doorway saying, "This is my home too now," like she was surprised to mean it, and meaning it anyway. He sat there until the lamp oil burned low. Then he got up, checked the door locks, the way he checked them every night, and went to bed. The ranch was quiet. but it was the quiet of a place that had people in it now, and that Dylan McCall was beginning to understand was an entirely different kind of quiet than the one he'd been living in. Entirely different. And better. God help him better. The letter from Asa Morrow arrived on a Monday, and Evelyn read it twice before she handed it to Dylan without a word. The preemptive filing had gone through. The Northern 40 was now registered at the state level outside Hardin County's jurisdiction entirely. Morrow had written in his careful lawyer's hand that Consolidated Land would know about it within the week, and that their likely next move would be to challenge the original 1876 deed on grounds of improper witness signatures. A thin argument, Morrow said, but not impossible to make noise with, and making noise was sometimes the point. Dylan folded the letter and set it on the table. "He's right about the noise," he said. "That's what they do. Make enough legal confusion that it costs more to fight than to sell." "We're not selling," Evelyn said. "No," he said. "We're not." She looked at him. He looked at her. And something passed between them in that moment. Not words, not yet, but the particular understanding of two people who have decided to stand in the same direction and mean it. Then Samuel came in from outside with a torn sleeve and a story about a fence post that was entirely his fault, and the moment broke into the ordinary business of the morning. But it had happened. Dylan knew it had happened. He filed it away in the part of himself where he kept the things that mattered. It was Cal who brought the first real trouble. Not deliberately. Cal was 19 and loyal, and not particularly subtle about either quality, which meant that when he came back from town on Wednesday with feed supplies and a tighter expression than usual, Dylan saw it from across the yard before the boy had even climbed down from the wagon. "What happened?" Dylan said. Not a question. Cal tied off the horse and turned around. Ran into Pratt at the feed store. He wasn't alone. Who was with him? Man I didn't know, dressed like money. Asked me some questions about the ranch. Cal's jaw was set. About you specifically. How long you'd been here, whether you'd had any trouble with the law. Dylan went very still. What did you say? I said you'd been here since '76, and the only trouble on this ranch was the kind that came looking for it. Then I loaded the wagon and left. Good. Dylan! Cal hesitated. The boy almost never hesitated. The man with Pratt, he said your name like he knew you, not like he was learning it, like he'd already looked you up. The cold thing moved through Dylan's chest again, the same thing he'd felt at the fence line when Pratt had ridden up. Familiar. Unpleasant. Not fear exactly, because Dylan McCall had been afraid enough times in his life to know the difference between that and the recognition of a serious problem. Did he give a name? Dylan said. Hargrove. Said he was regional representative for Consolidated Land. Hargrove. Dylan didn't know the name, but that didn't mean the name didn't know him. That was the part that mattered. Like he'd already looked you up. He thanked Cal and sent him to unload the wagon, and then he stood in the yard for a moment and let himself think about what that meant. Consolidated had done research. They'd gone looking into his past, not the ranch's past his, which meant they thought his past was something they could use. The question was, how much had they found? He didn't tell Evelyn that night. He told himself it was because there was nothing specific to tell yet which was true, and not because he didn't want to see what her face did with the information, which was also true in a way he wasn't ready to look at directly. Instead, he sat at the table after supper while she put Samuel to bed, and he thought about the war. He didn't do that often, because it was a habit that led nowhere useful, but sometimes the war thought about him first, and tonight was one of those nights. He had been 19 when he enlisted. He had been 23 when he came home, which was not the same thing as returning. He had done what soldiers did in wartime. He had followed orders, and he had survived. And some of the orders had been the kind that a man carried with him the rest of his life. Not because he was proud of them, but because the weight of them was his to carry, and there was no setting it down. He was not a bad man. He knew that now with more certainty than he had at 23, when he hadn't been sure of much of anything. But he was a man with a past that could be shaped into a story by someone who wanted to shape it, and shaped stories were more dangerous than true ones, because they were easier to believe. He heard Evelyn come back down the hall. Her footsteps had a particular sound, not heavy, not light, the kind of step that covered ground without announcing itself. She came into the kitchen and looked at him sitting at the table with his hands flat on the wood and nothing in front of him. "You haven't moved since I left," she said. "I've been thinking." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She didn't ask what he'd been thinking about. She just waited in that way she had, patient and direct at once, like a person who understood that some things had to come out at their own pace, and hurrying them only made them come out wrong. He told her about Cal, about Hargrove, about like he'd already looked you up. She listened without moving. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them made the only sound the small, steady hiss of burning oil. "They're looking for something on you," she said. "Yes." "Is there something to find?" He met her eyes. "That depends on who's doing the finding and what they intend to do with it." She held his gaze without flinching. "Then tell me. Whatever it is. Tell me yourself before they tell me their version, because their version will be designed to do damage, and yours will be the truth." Dylan looked at her across the table, this woman who had asked for solid, who had read his accounts and settled his mare, and faced the idea of consolidated land without blinking, and he made a decision. "I was at Chickamauga," he said. 73rd Indiana Volunteer Infantry under General Thomas. I was 22. We held the line at Horseshoe Ridge while the rest of the army retreated. He paused. There were orders issued during that action that some of them were not the kind of orders that look clean afterward, in the record, when someone reads them without understanding what the ground looked like. What kind of orders? The kind that stop an advance by any means available. He looked at his hands. We stopped it. But the means available that day included things that war doesn't look like the story people tell about it afterward. The record shows what happened. It doesn't show why. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Were you following orders?" she said. "Yes." "Did you do anything you chose to do that you're ashamed of?" The question was so direct, it almost knocked the breath out of him. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't cruel at all. It was the most honest question anyone had ever asked him about it, and honest questions hit different than careful ones. "No," he said, and then slower. "I've been ashamed of things I didn't choose, of what the situation required, of the fact that I survived it, and some men didn't." He looked up. "But I didn't do anything I chose to do that crossed the line of what I could live with." She nodded once. Something in her that had been held taut went slightly less taut. "Then what they have on you is a story," she said. "And stories can be contested." "Evelyn, don't tell me it's complicated," she said quietly. "I know it's complicated. Everything worth anything is complicated." She leaned forward slightly. "I told you before I'm not going anywhere. That includes not going anywhere when it gets harder. That's what I meant when I said I wanted this to be a real home. Real homes don't only stand up in good weather." Dylan sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, "You're a harder woman than you look." She almost smiled, the precursor smile, the one that lived just before she let herself. "I know," she said. "Most people don't figure that out this fast." The next morning, Dylan rode to Morrow's office with the new information, and the lawyer listened with the expression of a man who was not surprised, but had hoped to be. "Hargrove," Morrow said. "Yes, I know the name. He's Consolidated's man for the difficult acquisitions. When they want something that isn't selling, Hargrove is who they send." He tapped his desk. "If they're looking into your war record, they're planning a reputation play. Try to make the county afraid of you, or make it inconvenient for the local court to rule in favor of a man with a questionable history. My history isn't questionable. No, but it can be made to look it." Morrow looked at him over his spectacles. "Dylan, I have to ask you plainly. Is there anything in your service record that someone with access to military records and the willingness to present it selectively could use to create a public problem for you?" Dylan was quiet for a moment. "Possibly," he said. Morrow nodded slowly. "Then we need to be ahead of it. I can file a character attestation with the court, get statements from men who served with you from community members here. Build a record before they can poison the well." "How long?" 2 weeks if I move fast." "Move fast," Dylan said. He rode home under a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and sun, the way April in Texas sometimes couldn't decide between almost anything. And he thought about Hargrove in the feed store asking Cal questions like he'd already looked you up. And he thought about what it cost to have a past in a world where other people could pick it up and use it like a weapon. He thought about Evelyn saying, "Tell me yourself before they tell me their version." He had. And she had not looked at him differently afterward. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. 3 days later, on a Thursday evening, everything changed. Not the legal fight that was still building in Morrow's office, and the county records room, and wherever Hargrove was making his arrangements. That would take its own time. What changed on Thursday evening was smaller and larger at once, the way the things that actually matter usually are. Evelyn had put Samuel to bed early. The boy had worn himself to complete exhaustion, helping Hector repair the barn roof in the afternoon, an enterprise that had involved Samuel primarily handing things up from below, and asking questions about every single one of them, which Hector had answered with inexhaustible patience. She came back to the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment, and Dylan looked up from the papers he was reviewing and saw her face in the lamplight. And there was something in it he hadn't seen before. Not the careful composure. Not the efficient calm. Something that had been held a long time and was getting harder to hold. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Not across from him, beside him, at the corner of the table, which was closer than they usually sat. He didn't remark on it. She looked at the lamp for a while. Then she said, "I want to tell you what I was trying to say when I arrived. She stopped. A small breath. "When I said you're my first," and then couldn't finish it. Dylan set down his pen. The kitchen was very quiet. "I was going to say," she said slowly, "that you're the first man that I've ever stood in front of voluntarily." She looked at her hands. "Samuel's father I was 17. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to. By the time I understood Samuel existed, and that man was gone, and I was on my own." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said everything that had cost her the most. "There were 2 situations after that where circumstances required me to be careful. I was careful. I got out. But Her voice caught very slightly. Caught and held. "I had decided that I would not do this again. That I would not be in a situation that required depending on a man. On what a man decided to be." Dylan didn't move. He barely breathed. "And then I read your letter," she said. "And I don't know what it was. Something in it. The way you wrote around the edges of what you wanted without overstating any of it. You said you weren't cruel, like it was the minimum, not the standard. And somehow it was more honest than anything that had been dressed up to sound good." She lifted her eyes to his face. "And I thought maybe this one time." The lamp between them hissed softly in the quiet. "So when I stepped off that wagon," she said, "and you were standing there and I was terrified, I wanted to say you're my first. The first one I chose. The first time I walked toward instead of away." Her voice was low and steady and absolutely undefended in a way he had not heard from her before. "And I couldn't finish it because I didn't know yet if I was right, and I was frightened of being wrong again." Dylan looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had walked onto his land carrying the weight of everything that had been done to her and the even heavier weight of having survived it, who had read his accounts and settled his horse and faced consolidated land, and asked him the most honest question anyone had ever asked him about the war, who had moved his kitchen table 6 inches to the left and been right about it. He reached across the corner of the table and took her hands. She went very still. Not tense still. The way something goes still when it is deciding whether it is safe. His hands were rough from 13 years of fence line and drought and war-damaged land. Hers were smaller and stronger than they looked, with calluses at the base of the fingers from work she had done before she ever came here. He held them gently and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You were right." She looked at him. "You were right to choose it," he said. "Whatever happened before, whatever you were carrying when you stepped off that wagon, you read me correctly. I'm not going to be what those other situations were. I can't promise you easy. I can't promise you that what's coming with Consolidated is going to be clean or fast or painless. But I can promise you that what I am is what I told you in that letter. Not more, not less." Her hands tightened slightly in his. Just slightly. "Dylan," she said. Her voice was barely above the lamp. "Then I'll be your last," he said. The words came out quiet and certain, like something he had known for a while and was only now saying out loud. Not a declaration dressed up for effect, not a performance of feeling. Just the truth delivered in the same plain way she had delivered hers. No excess, no ornament, nothing but what it was. She stared at him. The careful composure was entirely gone. Now he could see exactly what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was a woman who had been braced for the world to disappoint her, and was finding that right now, in this moment, it hadn't. "You don't—" She stopped, steadied. "You don't have to say that." "I know," he said. "I said it because it's true." Her eyes were bright in the lamplight. Not tears yet. She was too held together for tears without a fight, but close. The kind of close that meant something had been reached that mattered. "I don't know what this is yet," she said quietly. "Between us, I don't know what to call it." "Neither do I," Dylan said. "But I know what it isn't." He held her gaze. "It isn't temporary, and it isn't convenient. And it isn't something I'm doing because I have nowhere else to go." She looked at him for a long, full moment. And then, not the precursor, not the almost. She smiled. A real one. Small and unsteady and entirely new, like something that hadn't been used in a long time and wasn't sure yet of its own strength. But real. "Okay," she said softly. He didn't let go of her hands right away. She didn't pull them back. They sat like that for a while, not talking, the lamp burning between them, the ranch quiet outside. At some point she made more coffee, and they sat with the cups and the accounts spread between them, and worked through the Morrow correspondence together, her hand occasionally brushing his when she reached for a paper. Both of them pretending that nothing fundamental had shifted, and both of them knowing that it had. When she finally went down the hall to her room, Dylan sat alone at the table for a long time. He thought about what he had said. Then, "I'll be your last." He had meant it as a vow of loyalty, a promise of steadiness, not possession. He thought she had understood that. He believed she had understood it. She was not a woman who misread things, but the meaning of it was still settling in him, the weight of having said it, the particular gravity of a promise, made not out of obligation or arrangement, but out of something he hadn't had a name for until it left his mouth. Something he had now. He thought about Hargrove in the feed store, about the documents Morrow was building, about Gerald Pratt and Consolidated Land, and whatever was still coming toward them, in the shape it hadn't yet revealed. He thought about all of it laid out in the darkness of his kitchen, like a map of ground he was going to have to cross. And then he thought about her hands in his. Her smile in the lamplight, small and unsteady, and entirely real. He thought about Samuel on the fence rail, asking, "Are you going to leave?" in the voice of a child who had already learned what leaving meant and was taking very careful inventory. Dylan McCall had made a promise tonight, not the kind that dissolved when circumstances got complicated. The other kind. The kind you made because you had finally found something worth the weight of it. He sat until the lamp burned low. Then he got up, checked the lock, stood for a moment in the hallway outside her door, Not because he needed to do anything, just because the house felt different now, and he wanted to know that he could feel it. He could. He went to bed. He did not lie awake. For the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, Dylan McCall went to sleep without having to negotiate with the dark. And in the morning, when he woke, the first thing he thought about was not the war, and not consolidated land, and not the 43 head of cattle, or the legal filing at the state level, or the fence line on the eastern edge. The first thing he thought about was the sound of her voice saying the first one I chose, and the fact that he intended, no matter what came next, to be worth that. The notice arrived on a Saturday morning, which Dylan would later think was deliberate. Saturdays were when men were away from their lawyers. It came by county courier, a young man Dylan didn't recognize, who handed over the envelope with the particular expression of someone who had been paid to deliver something unpleasant and had made his peace with that. Dylan signed for it and stood in the yard and read it while the courier rode away. It was a formal challenge to the 1876 deed. Not on the grounds Morrow had predicted improper witness signatures, but on something older and harder to counter quickly. A claim that the original land grant from which Dylan's deed derived had been fraudulently recorded in 1871 before the deed chain even reached him. If the 1871 grant was invalid, every deed that descended from it was invalid, including his. It was, Dylan recognized with cold clarity, elegant. It reached back far enough that he couldn't have known about it when he purchased the property. It made him look like a victim of the original fraud, rather than a target, which was exactly the kind of language that made judges sympathetic to the party doing the challenging, because it implied the challenger was simply correcting an old wrong. He read it twice. Then he folded it and went inside. Evelyn was at the table working through the week's correspondence. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way she always read his face now, fast, complete, without asking permission. He handed her the notice. She read it. Her expression didn't change, but he saw her jaw tighten once very slightly at the 1871 claim. She finished, set it down, and looked at him. They went back further than Morrow expected, she said. Yes. How hard is it to contest a fraudulent 1871 land grant? Depends on whether the fraud actually happened. She looked at the notice again. It didn't happen. That's the point. They're manufacturing it. She sat back. Which means there's a document somewhere in the county records or the state archive that they've either altered or intend to alter. And they filed this now to get ahead of whatever Morrow is building. Dylan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Morrow needs to see this today. It's Saturday. I know where he lives. She stood up immediately. I'm coming with you. He looked at her. I know what to look for in the land grant records, she said. My father's situation, the men who came with papers after he died, they used a similar strategy. I spent 2 years afterward learning exactly how it worked, because I swore I would never be caught without knowing again. She was already moving toward the hall to get her coat. If there's an altered document in the county archive, I can find where they changed it. Dylan didn't argue. He went to get the horses. Morrow lived 4 miles outside Beaumont, in a house that had the permanent look of a place owned by a man who spent all his time in his office. He came to the door in his shirt sleeves and took one look at Dylan's face and stepped aside without a word. He read the notice at his kitchen table while Evelyn stood at his bookshelf and pulled out 2 volumes of Texas land law without asking and started reading with the focused speed Dylan had seen her apply to his account ledgers that first week. Morrow set the paper down. The 1871 grant, he said. They're claiming the original surveyor was operating without proper commission. Was he? Dylan said. That's what I'm going to find out first thing Monday. Morrow looked at Evelyn, who had not looked up from the law book. Mrs. McCall, what are you looking for? The proper form for a surveyor's commission in Texas in 1871? She said without looking up. If they're going to claim it was improper, there'll be a specific technical requirement they'll say wasn't met. I want to know what that requirement is before they tell us, so we know what they've written into whatever they've fabricated. She turned a page. Here. She read for a moment. A surveyor's commission in 1871 required countersignature from the county clerk and the district land commissioner. 2 signatures. Correct, Morrow said, leaning forward. So they'll claim one is missing from the original commission document, Evelyn said, which means there's a document in the county archive that currently has both signatures, and they need to either remove one or produce an alternate version that never had it. She looked up at Morrow. Where are the 1871 county archive records kept? Morrow was staring at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. The county clerk's office, 2nd floor of the courthouse. Who has access after hours? The clerk, his deputy, and technically the county judge. Dillon and Evelyn looked at each other across Morrow's kitchen. Judge Calhoun, Dillon said. Morrow's expression went carefully neutral. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Dillon stood up. File an emergency injunction Monday morning to seal the 1871 records pending the challenge. Don't let them get to those documents before we can get an independent examiner in. That will take until Monday morning, Asa. First thing. Morrow looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. First thing. They rode back in the afternoon with the kind of silence between them that was not empty. It was full of the same thing running parallel. Calhoun, Evelyn said finally. He's been county judge for 11 years, Dillon said. Appointed, not elected. I never had occasion to think about who appointed him until right now. Consolidated. Almost certainly. She rode for a moment. How many people in this county know what Consolidated has been doing? Enough to be worried, not enough to be loud about it. We need to change that. She looked at him. Not just the legal fight, Dillon. We need people to know. Ranchers who still have their land, who understand what it means if Consolidated gets creek access through your northern 40. They connect those 2 sections, they control water rights for half the county. Dillon hadn't thought about it in those terms yet, not as a county-wide problem, just as his problem. But she was right. She was right, and she had seen it faster than he had. There's a meeting at the Grange Hall in 3 weeks, he said. County ranchers. I haven't gone in 2 years. We're going this year, she said. They were 2 miles from the ranch when Dillon heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the afternoon, not wind, not livestock, not the ordinary sounds of the land. Something sharper. Something that made the back of his neck go cold with the particular instinct that had kept him alive at Chickamauga. He pulled up Goliath without a word. Evelyn pulled up beside him. What? She started. He held up one hand. She went silent immediately. He listened. There it was again. From the direction of the ranch. A man's voice raised, then another, then nothing. Stay behind me, he said. Dillon, please, he said. Just the one word, flat and serious, and she heard it for what it was. Not control, not dismissal, but the voice of a man who had learned to read danger and was reading it right now. She stayed behind him. They rode fast. They came up on the ranch from the east side, which kept them out of the direct sight line of the yard until the last moment. What Dillon saw when they cleared the tree line stopped everything in him for one hard second. 3 men on horseback in the yard. Not Pratt. None of them were Pratt. Bigger men, working men, the kind hired for their size and their willingness rather than their intelligence. Hector was standing by the barn door with his hands at his sides and his chin up, which was how Hector stood when he was frightened and refusing to show it. Cal was nowhere visible, which meant Cal had been smart enough to get out of the yard. One of the mounted men was holding a paper, some kind of document, and talking in the raised voice Dillon had heard from 2 miles out. The other 2 were positioned in a way that was not accidental. One near the barn, one near the house. Near the house, where Samuel was. Dillon felt something move through him that was not quite any one emotion. It was the place past emotion, where the body simply committed, where the years of training and survival compressed into absolute clarity of purpose. He rode into the yard at a pace that was not fast, but was completely deliberate, and the 3 men turned at the sound of hooves. McCall, the one with the paper, said. He was trying for authority, and landing somewhere short of it. "We're here on behalf of Consolidated Land and Resources. We have a—" "I read the notice," Dylan said. He stopped Goliath 10 feet from the man and looked at him from the saddle. "Whatever you're holding isn't anything my lawyer hasn't already seen. You rode out here on a Saturday to 3 people and a 60-year-old ranch hand because you thought the paper would be more frightening delivered in person." The man's jaw tightened. "Mr. Hargrove has authorized us to make a direct offer. 50 cents on the dollar for the full property effective immediately as a settlement of the legal—" "No," Dylan said. "Just that. One word, flat as a table. Mr. McCall, if you'd let me finish." I said no. Dylan looked at each of the 3 men in turn, slow and deliberate, the way he had once looked at men across very different kinds of ground. "You're on my property. You were not invited. You've delivered your message, and I've given you my answer. Now you're going to ride out the same way you rode in, and you're going to tell Hargrove that the next time he wants to communicate with me, he can do it through Asa Morrow in Beaumont, because that's the only conversation I'm interested in having." Silence. The man with the paper looked at the other 2. Something passed between them, a calculation, a reassessment. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the man said. "Probably," Dylan said. "That's my right." Another beat. Then the man folded the paper and put it in his coat and turned his horse. The other 2 followed. Dylan watched them ride out of the yard and down the road and kept watching until they were out of sight. Then he got down from the saddle. Hector let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for the better part of an hour. "Glad you got back when you did," the old man said. "They'd been here 20 minutes. I didn't know where to—" "You did right," Dylan said. "Where's Cal?" "Went for the rifle when they rode in. I told him to hold." Hector paused. "Was that right?" "Yes, that was exactly right." Evelyn had dismounted and was already moving toward the house. Dylan followed her, and when they came through the door, Samuel was standing in the middle of the front room with wide eyes and a piece of firewood in both hands, held up like a weapon, which was so exactly the right-wrong thing that Dylan felt something break open in his chest with a force that surprised him. "Samuel?" Evelyn said, her voice cracking slightly on the name. "I heard men," the boy said. He didn't lower the firewood. "I was going to—" "I know," she said, going to him. She took the wood out of his hands gently and pulled him against her. "I know you were." Dylan stood in the doorway and watched her hold her son, and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle into him. Not the confrontation in the yard, not the legal threat, but this. A boy who had grabbed a piece of firewood because the men he'd learned about told him you protected what was yours. A woman who had ridden back with him into danger without hesitation. A house that now contained people worth protecting in a way that changed the entire calculation of everything. He had been protecting land before. He was protecting something larger now. That night, after Samuel was asleep, genuinely asleep, worn out by fear and relief, and Evelyn's careful, quiet reassurance, they sat at the kitchen table, and Dylan told her everything. Not just about the men in the yard or Hargrove or the Saturday notice. Everything. The full shape of what he thought Consolidated was planning. The way they would use the fraudulent 1871 claim as a public argument, while the real pressure came in private visits like today, social damage through rumor legal costs, designed to exhaust rather than to win. And then he told her what he hadn't told her yet. Before the war, he said the land I grew up on was taken the same way. My family's land. My father owed a debt, a legitimate debt, not a manufactured one, but the man who held it was willing to call it on 30 days' notice during a bad year, and my father couldn't meet it. He looked at his hands on the table. We lost it when I was 17. 6 months later, my father was dead. My mother went to live with her sister in Ohio. He paused. I came to Texas after the war because I wanted land that was mine and stayed mine, because I understood what it meant to lose it. Evelyn was very still. I'm telling you this, he said, because you need to understand why I'm not walking away from this fight regardless of how hard it gets. It's not just strategy. It's not even just about you and Samuel, though. He stopped. Let a breath settle. That matters more than anything else right now. But I also need you to know I have personal history with exactly this kind of situation, which means I might not be entirely rational about it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Dylan," she said, "you just stood in your yard and sent 3 large men back the way they came with one word. You're the most rational person I know when it counts." She paused. "And I already knew." He looked up. "Knew what?" "That this was personal for you. I could tell from the first time you talked about the land the way a person talks about something when the meaning is deeper than the surface." She held his gaze. "I didn't ask because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." He stared at her. "You are the most perceptive woman I've ever met," he said, and meant it without any softening. "I know," she said. "It's been useful." But her eyes were warm when she said it, and the warmth was real. Braptag. The next 3 days moved fast and ugly. Monday morning, Morrow filed the injunction to seal the 1871 records. By Monday afternoon, the county clerk, a man named Dobbs, who had held the position for 8 years, refused to comply on the grounds that the injunction exceeded the requesting court's authority. Morrow filed an appeal to the state level by end of day, Tuesday. The Beaumont Courier ran a story. Dylan read it at the kitchen table with Evelyn beside him, and what he felt when he read it was cold and precise, and not at all surprised. The story was about a rancher in Hardin County with a contested deed and a troubled war record. It didn't name him directly, it was careful enough for that, but it described a man who had come to Texas after the war with a history that local families deserved to know about, given the legal dispute now in question. It quoted an unnamed source close to the county court. Evelyn read it beside him without touching it, like the paper itself was the thing to be careful of. "Unnamed source close to the county court," she said. "Calhoun or someone in his office?" "Yes." "They're moving faster than Morrow expected." "Yes." She looked at him. "Does it bother you? The story?" He considered that, honestly. "It bothers me that people who don't know me will read it. It bothers me for Samuel if children at school see it, or their parents do." He looked at the paper. "It doesn't shake me, if that's what you're asking." "It's what I was asking." She took the paper and folded it and put it in the stove without ceremony. He watched it catch. "We need to go to the Grange meeting," she said. "Not in 3 weeks. Now. Can it be moved up?" "I'd have to ride to 6 ranches and ask." "Then ride to 6 ranches." He went that afternoon. 3 of the 6 ranchers he visited men he'd known since he came to Hardin County. Men who had their own reasons to watch Consolidated's moves, with unease agreed immediately. The other 2 said they'd come if the 3rd man, Chester Aldridge, came. Chester Aldridge was the largest independent rancher in the eastern county, a stubborn, careful man who didn't move fast on anything and was trusted for exactly that reason. Dylan rode to Aldridge's ranch last. Chester met him on the porch and listened to everything without expression. Then he was quiet for a long moment, looking out past his property at something Dylan couldn't see. "My north section borders the land they took from the Pelham family last year," Chester said finally. "I know," Dylan said. "Pelham told me what it was like. The paper stories first. Then the legal cost. Then an offer they said was better than what a court would give them." Chester's jaw worked. He didn't want to sell. "I know that too." Another long silence. "Thursday," Chester said. "My barn. I'll get word to the others." He looked at Dylan directly. "You bring your wife. I want to hear what she's figured out because from what I'm hearing, she's figured out more than most." Dylan nodded. "Thursday." "Yep, heard that." He told Evelyn that night and watched her absorb it, the 6 ranchers Chester Aldridge Thursday's meeting. "He wants me there specifically," she said. "He said bring your wife because she's figured out more than most." She blinked. Then something crossed her face, not quite the smile, but close to it. The warmer than usual version of her composed expression. "He doesn't know me." "He knows what you've done. News travels in this county." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her organizing, not her feelings. She was always organized about those, but the information. The argument she would make on Thursday to 6 men who had spent their lives being cautious and needed a reason to stop. "I need to write some things down," she said, and got up and went to the desk in the front room. Dylan sat at the kitchen table and listened to the scratch of her pen in the other room, and the quiet sounds of the ranch at night, and Samuel's slow breathing through the cracked door down the hall. He thought about Consolidated Land and Hargrove and Judge Calhoun and the story in the Courier that Evelyn had burned without drama. He thought about 3 men on horseback in his yard and a 4-year-old boy with a piece of firewood held up in both hands. He thought about what he'd said to her in this kitchen a week ago. Then, "I'll be your last," and what it meant now that people had come to his yard on a Saturday to make that promise harder to keep. It didn't shake the promise. He noticed that specifically. He looked at it directly the way you looked at something you wanted to know the truth about, examined it for any sign of wavering. Nothing. If anything, what had happened in the yard had made it solider, more specific, less of a feeling and more of a fact, the way some things only became real when they were tested and held. The pen had gone quiet in the front room. Then Evelyn appeared in the doorway, and she looked at him with an expression he was still learning the language of, still building the vocabulary for, but which he was beginning to be able to read. "I need you to tell me one more thing," she said. "All right. The war record. Whatever is in it that they think they can use." She stood in the doorway with her chin level and her eyes steady. "I need to know all of it. Not because I doubt you. Because on Thursday, if Chester Aldridge or any of those ranchers have read the Courier story, I need to be able to look them in the eye and tell them what the truth is. And I can only do that if I know it completely." Dylan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down." She sat, and he told her. All of it. Every piece he had kept quiet for 13 years, not because it was shameful, but because he had never trusted anyone enough to put it in their hands. The orders, the ground, the choices that weren't choices, the men who didn't come home, and the ones who did, and why the distance between those two groups had nothing to do with worthiness and everything to do with the particular cruelty of which way you were facing when the shooting started. He talked for a long time. She listened without moving. When he finished, the lamp had burned nearly to nothing, and the night outside was completely quiet, and she was looking at him with something in her face that he had no word for. Not pity. Nothing like pity, and not the managed sympathy of a person being careful. Something older and more serious. The look of someone who has just been handed the heaviest thing a person carries and has decided without drama or announcement to help carry it. "You were 22 years old," she said. "Yes. And you've been carrying this alone since then?" He didn't answer. The answer was obvious. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not the other way around this time, her reaching, her choosing. "Not anymore," she said. The lamp guttered once and caught and held. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and dark and full of everything that was still coming toward them. Hargrove and Calhoun, and the county court, and Consolidated Land, and all the shape of it still unclear in the dark. But inside this kitchen, in the circle of the lamp's light, Dylan McCall felt something he had not felt in 13 years of going it alone. He felt held, not saved, not rescued, not managed or handled or pitied, held. By someone who had chosen to stand next to him with full knowledge of the weight. He turned his hand over under hers and held on. Thursday came the way serious days always came, quietly, without announcement, as if the weight of what was about to happen preferred not to be noticed until it was already underway. Chester Aldridge's barn held 8 men by the time Dylan and Evelyn arrived, which was 2 more than Dylan had ridden to invite, which meant word had moved on its own. That was either good or it was a problem, and Dylan didn't know which yet. He scanned the faces as he came through the door. Men, he knew men who knew him. Men who had read the Courier story and come anyway, which told him something important about where they stood. Chester met them in the door. He was a broad, weathered man in his late 50s who had the handshake of someone who had been doing physical work since before most people in the room were born. And he gave Dylan the handshake, and then looked at Evelyn with the direct, assessing gaze of a man who made decisions carefully, and had already started making this one. "Mrs. McCall," he said. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. "Thank you for calling this. Thank your husband. I've been watching Consolidated move across this county for 2 years and waiting for someone to say the thing out loud." He stepped back and gestured them inside. "Say the thing." She did. Dylan had known she was prepared. He'd heard the pen the night before, had seen her at the table that morning, with the documents arranged in the particular order that meant she knew exactly what she was going to say and in what sequence. But watching her stand in Chester Aldridge's barn and address 8 Texas ranchers, who had every reason to be cautious and none to be trusting, was something different from knowing she was prepared. She started with the 1871 land grant claim. She explained in plain language without a single word of legal ornament exactly what Consolidated was alleging, why the allegation was manufactured, and what document in the county archive they needed to access or alter to make it stick. She laid out the surveyor's commission requirement, the 2 signatures, and explained what the original document would show and what a fabricated version would lack. Then she talked about Chester's north section and the Pelham family, and the 2 sections Consolidated already held on either side of Dylan's northern 40. She drew it in the air with her hands. No paper, no diagram. Just the shape of it in the air between her and 8 men who understood land, the way they understood their own names. "If they get Dylan's northern 40, she said, "they hold the creek from the Henderson Fork to the county line. Every rancher in this room whose cattle drink from that creek or whose irrigation draws from it becomes dependent on what Consolidated decides to charge for access. That is not a hypothetical. That is what happened in Calhoun County in 1878 and Parker County in 1879. I have the records." She pulled the folded papers from her coat. Morrow had gotten them from the state archive, and she had read every page and held them up. The room was very quiet. Chester Aldridge looked at the papers. Then he looked at Dylan. "She always like this?" "Yes," Dylan said. Chester looked back at Evelyn. "What do you need from us?" What she needed was testimony. Specifically signed affidavits from every rancher in the room, attesting to the long-standing, unchallenged use of the creek water, the property lines as they had always been understood, and the timeline of Consolidated's activity in the county. Each affidavit taken together built a record of community recognition of the existing deed structure that would make any challenge to the 1871 grant not just legally weak, but publicly absurd. Every man in the room signed. Chester Aldridge signed first, which meant the other 7 didn't hesitate, because Chester Aldridge not hesitating was the only signal they needed. When it was done, Evelyn gathered the papers with steady hands and looked at the room and said simply, "Thank you. This matters." Chester walked them out to the horses. The night air was cool and smelled like rain that had already passed through. "The Courier story," Chester said to Dylan. "I read it." "I know. My father talked about Chickamauga," Chester said. "He was on the other side. He said the men who held Horseshoe Ridge that day were the hardest soldiers he ever saw." He looked at Dylan directly. "Whatever they're planning to say about your record, they can say it. People in this county who know what that battle was will know what it means." Dylan looked at him. "I appreciate that, Chester." "Don't appreciate it. Just win." Chester went back inside. Dylan stood for a moment in the dark. Then Evelyn's hand found his arm, not holding just there, a point of contact, and he looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. They rode home. Morrow had the affidavits by Friday morning and the state appeal response by Friday afternoon. The state court ruled that the 1871 county records were to be sealed pending independent examination. Judge Calhoun's refusal to comply with the original injunction was noted in the ruling in language that Morrow described as the legal equivalent of being called a liar in public. It should have been enough to slow Consolidated down. It wasn't. The trouble came Sunday night after midnight, when Dylan woke to Goliath making a sound in the barn that no horse made without reason. He was out of bed before he was fully awake, the old instinct moving his body while his mind caught up. He pulled on his boots and took the rifle from beside the door and went through the kitchen to the back without lighting a lamp. Outside the yard was dark. He stood still and listened. Two sounds. One near the barn, Goliath still unsettled. One near the northern fence line, something that didn't belong to the night. A footstep on hardpan, trying to be quiet, and not entirely succeeding. Dylan moved along the side of the house, keeping close using the dark the way he had learned to use it a long time ago. He got to the corner where he could see the fence line and stopped. Two men. Working at the fence post where the survey marker was staked, the marker that established the northern boundary. One holding a lantern low shielded, the other crouched at the post. They were moving the marker, not taking it, moving it. Shifting the survey stake 6 feet south, which on paper would shift the northern boundary 6 feet south, which on a contested deed meant the acreage claimed by the deed no longer matched the acreage on the ground. It was the kind of physical fraud that supported a document fraud, the two pieces fitting together to make the fabricated story coherent. Dylan stepped out from the side of the house. "Stop," he said, not loud, flat and final. Both men froze. "Stand up," he said. "Hands where I can see them." The man crouching at the post stood slowly. The man with the lantern turned, and the light caught Dylan's face and went pale. "McCall," one of them started. "You're on my land after midnight moving my survey marker," Dylan said. "I don't need to know your names to know what that is, but I want your names anyway." Neither man spoke. "That was not a request," Dylan said. One of them gave a name, Deaver, he said, and the other was Moss. Working men hired hands faces Dylan had never seen before, not Pratt, not Hargrove. The men above them were careful enough to not be here themselves. "Here's what's going to happen," Dylan said. "You're going to put that stake back exactly where it was. Then you're going to walk off my property. Then you're going to tell whoever hired you that I have 2 witnesses who will testify to what you were doing here tonight." He didn't have 2 witnesses, he had himself. But they didn't know that, and the calculation on their faces told him the bluff had landed. The man called Deaver crouched back down and reset the marker. He did it fast with the precise care of a man who wanted to be done and gone, and Dylan watched every inch of it to make sure it was right. Then they left. He watched them go until he couldn't hear their footsteps anymore. He stood in the dark for a moment. Then he turned around, and Evelyn was standing 10 feet behind him with the kitchen lantern unlit in her hand and her eyes wide open and a cast iron pan held at her side. He stared at her. "I heard you get up," she said. Her voice was steady, but her breathing wasn't quite. "I followed." He looked at the cast iron pan. "Were you going to hit someone with that?" he said. "If I needed to," she said, completely serious. Dylan looked at her in the dark. This woman with her hair loose and her feet bare on the hard pan, and a frying pan held ready at her side, and felt something move through him so fast and complete that he didn't even try to identify it. He just stood in it. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you had it. I wasn't going to interfere, but I wasn't going to stand inside while something happened to you either." He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and she lifted her chin to look at him, and he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her. It was not a careful kiss. It was not planned or managed or measured. It was the accumulation of everything 47 days of mornings and accounts and fence lines and lamplit tables and hands held across corners of a mare settled and affidavits gathered and a Saturday notice burned in a stove and a 13-year-old wait finally spoken out loud. All of it compressed into one moment that neither of them had orchestrated, and both of them had been moving toward since April. She kissed him back. That was the thing. She kissed him back like she had been waiting to choose this, and was choosing it now fully, without reservation. When they separated, she was breathing differently, and so was he, and the Texas night was enormous around them and completely irrelevant. "Okay," she said, barely a word. More of a breath. "Okay," he said. They went back inside. Monday morning, Dylan rode to Morrow with a full account of Sunday night, the names the attempted marker moved the timeline. Morrow listened, and then sat back with the expression of a man who has just received the exact piece he needed. Physical tampering with a survey marker is a criminal offense under Texas statute, he said. Not a civil matter, criminal. That takes it entirely out of Calhoun's jurisdiction and into the district criminal court, which is appointed by Austin, not by Hardin County. He looked at Dylan. If those men can be identified and their connection to Consolidated established, this stops being a property dispute and starts being a conspiracy to commit fraud. Deaver and Moss, Dylan said. Hired hands. Find out who's been paying them. Morrow was already reaching for his pen. The criminal complaint was filed by end of day. By Tuesday, the district court in Austin had assigned an examiner to the 1871 archive records. By Wednesday, the examiner had found it not an altered document, but a forged one. A second version of the Surveyor's Commission record, filed under a slightly different date index, created to make the original look like a later edition rather than the primary record. The forgery was recent enough that the ink chemistry didn't match the paper age. The examiner put that in writing. Morrow sent Dylan a letter on Wednesday evening that contained 3 sentences. The 1871 claim has been withdrawn by Consolidated Land. The forged document has been referred to the district attorney. Gerald Pratt was arrested this morning at his home in Beaumont. Dylan read it at the kitchen table with Evelyn sitting beside him, and when he finished, he handed it to her and waited. She read it, set it down, said nothing for a long moment. Pratt, she said finally. Pratt, he said, not Hargrove. Not yet, he paused. But Pratt will talk. Men like Pratt always talk when the alternative is worse. She looked at the letter again. Something in her face was working through itself. Not celebration, not exactly. Something quieter. The particular expression of a person who has been holding themselves at tension for a long time and is only now beginning to believe the tension can be released. It's not over, she said. No, but the worst of it is. She nodded slowly. Then she folded the letter and held it in both hands and looked at the table. Dylan, she said. Yeah. I want to say something and I need you to let me finish it this time. He looked at her. His heart did something specific. All right, he said. She looked up at him, and there was nothing careful in her face now. None of the composure, none of the managed distance she had arrived with. Just her exactly, as she was gray eyes and strong hands, and 47 days of everything they had built without intending to build it. You're my first, she said. Her voice was clear and steady and completely unafraid. The first man I chose. The first safe place I've ever had that I didn't have to make alone. The first person who... She stopped for just a moment. Who made me believe that being chosen could be different from being owned? She held his gaze. I've been trying to finish that sentence since the day I stepped off that wagon and lost my nerve. I'm finishing it now. Dylan didn't move. He sat very still and let it come all the way in, all of it. Every word the full weight of what she was handing him, and what it had cost her, and what it meant that she was handing it anyway. Then he reached across the table and took her hands. I know, he said. I've been waiting for you to finish it. Her eyes went bright. She didn't look away. And I meant what I said, he said. I'll be your last. Not because you need me to be. Not because you can't stand on your own, you've proved that past any argument. But because I want to be. Because this... He looked at her hands in his at the table between them, at the house around them that had gone from an arrangement to something he didn't have a bigger word for. Because this is the only thing I've built since the war that I actually want to keep. A tear moved down her face. She didn't wipe it. She sat straight and let it go and kept looking at him with those clear, direct eyes. Okay, Dylan McCall, she said quietly. Then let's keep it. So, Hargrove was indicted 6 weeks later when Pratt had talked exactly as much as Dylan had predicted. The indictment named 4 consolidated land officers and 2 county officials, including Judge Calhoun, whose 11-year tenure came to an end on a Thursday morning when the Texas Rangers came to the courthouse in Beaumont and walked him out the front door in front of 12 people who had all been wondering for a while and were not particularly surprised. Chester Aldridge sent Dylan a note that said, "Only told you to win. You won." C. Dylan put it on the shelf in the kitchen, which was where Evelyn had started putting things that mattered. The Northern 40 stayed theirs. The creek stayed theirs. The cattle herd by the following spring had grown back to 71 head, which was not yet what it had been, but was more than it had been in 4 years. And more importantly, it was moving in the right direction, which was what mattered. Morrow filed the final deed confirmation in October. Dylan and Evelyn both signed it, which was Morrow's quiet acknowledgement of what had actually won the thing. He didn't say that out loud. He didn't have to. Samuel turned 5 in November and had grown 2 inches and could name every horse on the ranch and explain the difference between oxidized iron and rusted iron and identify 4 species of hawk by their wing beats. All information acquired from Hector and Dylan respectively delivered in the patient repetitive manner of men who understood that a child's questions were the most serious questions there were. He called Dylan by his name for 3 months. Then one morning in December, without preamble or announcement, he didn't. Dylan was at the stove when it happened. He didn't react visibly. He finished what he was doing and set the pan down and turned around, and Samuel was already at the table, eating with both hands, and complete focus, entirely unaware of having done anything significant. Dylan looked at Evelyn. She was looking back at him from the doorway with her hand over her mouth and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was feeling something she hadn't built walls for. He shook his head slightly. "Let it be." She nodded, dropped her hand, came to the table. They ate breakfast, all 3 of them, in the particular morning quiet of a household that had found its rhythm, not the silence of an empty house, not the careful quiet of people walking around each other, but the warm, lived-in quiet of people who were comfortable in the same space and didn't need to fill every moment of it. The night Dylan finally asked her properly with the ring he had ridden to Beaumont to buy and carried in his coat pocket for 11 days, waiting for the right moment, she didn't say yes immediately. He had expected her to. The moment felt right. The lamp between them, the house quiet. Samuel asleep, the ranch settled and safe around them. But she sat with it for a moment, holding the ring in both hands and looking at it with the focused attention she gave to everything that mattered, and he waited because he had learned to trust her process even when it made his chest tight. Then she looked up. "This isn't because of the legal settlement," she said. Not a question, a clarification she needed stated. "No." "And not because of Samuel?" "No, though Samuel is—" He paused. "Samuel is part of why I know what I want, but he's not the reason." "Then what's the reason?" He looked at her, straight on the way he'd learned she deserved to be looked at. "Because I came to Texas to build something that lasted," he said. "And you're the first thing I've built that I'd burn the rest of it down to keep." She looked at him for a long, full moment. Then she put the ring on her finger and said, "Yes," not with drama, not with tears, though those came a few minutes later and she let them, which told him everything about how safe she felt. Just yes. Clear and direct, and completely hers, the way she did everything. He reached across and pulled her to him, and she let herself be held, which she had told him once was the thing she had never let herself do before, because it required trusting that the person holding you would still be there when you needed to stand back up. She let herself be held, he held her, and the ranch was quiet around them. The horses in the barn, the cattle in the field. Samuel breathing slowly down the hall, the creek moving in the dark over the stones of the Northern 40 that no one was going to take from them. All of it settled, all of it real, all of it theirs. Months later, when people in Hardin County told the story, and they did tell it, the way people in small counties tell stories that matter to them, they got some of the details right and some wrong, the way stories always went. They got right that Dylan McCall had held his land against Consolidated when no one else had managed it. They got right that his wife had walked into Chester Aldridge's barn and made 8 cautious men sign their names to something. They got right that a forged document had brought down a county judge. What they didn't quite capture, what couldn't be captured in the telling, was the thing that had actually happened between a quiet cowboy who had stopped believing and a young woman who had arrived with 1 bag and a child and half a sentence she couldn't finish. The thing that had happened was not dramatic in the way the legal fight was dramatic. It had no single moment that made a good story, or rather, it had too many moments layered too deep, each one small and true and cumulative, in the way that real things were cumulative. A kitchen table moved 6 inches to the left. A mare settled under steady hands. A piece of corn cake and a jar of preserved peaches left beside a coffee pot without comment. A boy with a piece of firewood held up in both hands, guarding what was his. A woman finishing finally a sentence she had started the day she chose to walk toward something instead of away. These were the things that had built it. Not one moment, 100 moments, each one chosen. Each one meaning something about the kind of people they were deciding to be. Dylan McCall had come to Texas looking for something solid. He had found it. Not in the land, though the land was his and would stay his. Not in the victory over Consolidated, though the victory was real, and the justice of it was clean. He had found it in a woman who had seen him completely war, and all past, and all silence and had chosen to stay. Who had fought beside him, not because she had to, and not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had decided this was her fight too, and her land too, and her life too fully, and without condition. And she had found it in a man who had learned finally at 32 years old, and in the most unlikely of arrangements, that being loved was not the same as being owned. That a home was not a place that kept you, it was a place you kept choosing. On the last morning of that first year, Dylan stood in the kitchen before dawn with his coffee and listened to the house waking up around him. Samuel's first stirring. Evelyn's footsteps in the hall. The particular sounds of a life that had people in it. And he thought about a Tuesday that had started it. A letter he had almost thrown away. A woman stepping off a wagon with 1 bag and a child and a sentence she hadn't been able to finish. She came into the kitchen and looked at him standing there and didn't say anything because she had learned to read his quiet as well as he had learned to read hers. She poured her coffee and stood beside him. After a moment he said, "You were my first too." She looked up at him. "First person I let in," he said. "First home I didn't build alone." She held his gaze. Her eyes were clear and warm and completely unguarded. "Then we're even," she said softly. They stood together in the kitchen while the Texas dawn came up outside, and Samuel's feet hit the floor down the hall, and the horses moved in the barn. And the ranch came alive around them the way it did every morning, now full of sound, full of people, full of the particular noise of a life that was being lived instead of merely endured. Dylan McCall had promised to be her last. He intended to spend the rest of his life making sure that promise was the easiest one he'd ever kept.